Greetings, class. Welcome to the 8th lecture presentation for the Philosophy of Religion course. This topic today will be concepts of afterlife, and we will be looking at a particular paper by Joseph Prabhu called The Idea of Reincarnation. I prepared a lecture PowerPoint presentation for this lecture, so let me share the screen. Okay, as stated earlier, this 8th and final lecture presentation for the Philosophy of Religion course is on concepts of afterlife. And it is from an article by Joseph Prabhu called The Idea of Reincarnation. I will be reading some paragraphs from this article and then elaborating on them and then posing some questions toward the end. But I will read some of the highlights from the article and try to explain some of it. Okay, so Prabhu explains the scope of his paper called The Idea of Reincarnation. And I'll go ahead and read this. We won't be looking at each one of these steps, but we'll be looking at many of them. So he writes, I shall begin first with the argument defending the probability of survival of consciousness beyond physical death as against the extinction of all life after death. We will be looking at that. Next, I shall argue that there are good reasons why survival should take an embodied rather than a disembodied form. This one we will not look too much at, but I do invite you to read these ideas from the essay. Then he says, I shall contend further that these reasons are pointed to by the characteristics of our moral experience and provide in turn a perspective from which to look at our lives. We will focus quite a bit on this. Then I shall take up the question of empirical evidence. We won't spend too much time on this idea. And we'll explain why, because he's not looking at an empirical argument for it, rather he's looking at a transcendental argument for it. So we'll make that distinction as well. And then finally, I shall address some of the objections made against the idea and attempt to show that they are not decisive. The overall result of these investigations is to suggest the plausibility of a different view of life from that which seems to hold in our empirical scientific culture. And we'll look a bit at this. We'll look at the 3 objections that Prabhu explains for the idea of reincarnation. And then we'll look at the way he responds to these objections. And we'll also consider some of the ideas about how this concept of reincarnation in general is different than the current scientific paradigm. And sort of what that means, not scientifically, but philosophically what that means. So let's begin. So Prabhu's argument takes the form of Kant's argument. And so here he states, my argument for survival has the same form as Kant's, though a more phenomenological content, which I maintain points towards both a post-existence and a pre-existence, hence reincarnation. It is not just the abstract requirement of moral faith that entails an extension beyond empirical life. Rather, it is the concrete texture of our moral lives that suggests the need to go beyond the parameters of a single earthly life. So he's going to utilize Kant's argument, which we'll get to in a moment, to explain this idea of life after death. But then he's going to examine the argument further, particularly the phenomenological aspects of our moral experience, and suggest that that also implies pre-life experience or earlier lives lived. And so this is fascinating, first to utilize Kant's argument, which we'll go over in a second, but also to suggest from phenomenological experience that past lives also exist. So we'll look at how he does this. So Kant's argument for the immortality of the soul, and this is still Prabhu talking, I'm quoting from his paper. The fact that our moral consciousness, Kant argues, is the fact of our moral consciousness, Kant argues, is the guarantee of personal immortality. What does that mean? The highest good must consist of a union of virtue and happiness. The orientation of the ethical will is towards virtue, while that of the sensuous will is towards happiness. But between virtue and happiness, no causal relation exists empirically, while ethically no teleological reason can be permitted either. And yet our fundamental moral concept is one of ultimate justice, expressed in the thought that virtue alone is, in the final analysis, worthy of happiness. While we cannot, of course, use this eudaimonistic concept based on Aristotle, as the basis for morality, it still serves as a higher order transcendental postulate if morality is to be meaningful at all. So much of this essay, I find, is just trying to understand what everything in that one paragraph means. And so let's look what Kant means first by this transcendental argument for the immortality of the soul. So let's break down the premises here. So premise one that Kant observes, that sort of Prabhu states in his argument too, humans have a concept of virtue and a concept of happiness, right? And those two don't necessarily always dovetail completely, meaning the most virtuous people aren't always the happiest people. Or said another way, really bad things can happen to good people. And people who are not virtuous can experience lots of good things. And so an ultimate sense of justice might say, well why is that? Right? So this is a fascinating idea that Kant brings up. So premise one, humans have a concept of virtue and a concept of happiness. Premise two, ultimate justice suggests that a virtuous person should also be a happy person. And then premise three is just an observation. Many times virtuous people experience injustice, while invirtuous people experience happiness and no negative consequences for their action. So people who are not virtuous, who we might call wicked or evil, they might live a perfectly happy life and die happy and experience no negative consequences for this. Whereas a virtuous person might suffer a lot. And this concept doesn't make very much sense given our concept of virtue and our concept of ultimate justice. Premise four, this fact suggests the fact that virtuous people suffer and non-virtuous people experience happiness. This fact suggests that there's either no ultimate justice or that there is ultimate justice in an afterlife. And this is Kant's move essentially to justify an afterlife. But it's a transcendental move, and this is why. It's premise five. If there was no ultimate justice, the majority of human beings would behave very differently. This is what Kant thinks. Put another way, ultimate justice is a transcendental postulate which makes our reality possible. And so the conclusion here is since ultimate justice is real, in the sense that it can be shown to exist transcendentally, but since not experienced in this life, there must exist an afterlife in which it is experienced. So let's focus for a moment on the difference between a transcendental and an empirical argument, because both Kant and then in this article, Prabhu, are making a transcendental argument for the immortality of the soul, as opposed to an empirical argument. An empirical argument points to facts about the world and draws conclusions from them. So for example, there's many cases described of people who have near-death experiences and end up going to what they phenomenologically experience as a different realm, an afterlife. This might be viewed as an empirical evidence. Not empirical in the sense that it can be proven, but empirical in the sense that they're describing what occurred to them. This is not what a transcendental argument is. Right? A transcendental argument or a deduction points to the concepts a priori, or before experience, prior to experience, that make our experience possible, and then we draw conclusions from them. And this is a very powerful argument that Kant has. He said, essentially, because most people believe in ultimate justice and behave as though there is a sense of ultimate justice, that good behavior will be rewarded and evil behavior will be punished, this suggests that this concept actually exists. It's what makes our day-to-day lived experience possible. And this is not the only concept he did this for. He made a transcendental argument for. Another concept would be freedom. Are we free or are we determined? It's a very difficult question to answer. And Kant says a priori reason, or reasoning from prior to experience, just logic alone, it can't get you a good answer. Or said another way, the argument for being determined and the argument for being free are equally as good if you use reason to argue it, and therefore you can't use reason. So what do you use? Well, Kant thought you use the very structure in which reality is experienced. And our entire social reality, our interactions, are based on this idea of freedom. This is what freedom is, one of those concepts that make society's lived experience possible. Everything about our interactions assume freedom. And this, for Kant, suggests a transcendental reality or a transcendental deduction that this concept actually exists. If it didn't, our reality wouldn't be possible. And the same thing with ultimate justice. If ultimate justice didn't exist, people would behave so differently, morally speaking, that our type of reality, our experience of reality wouldn't be possible. And so we don't see ultimate justice in our empirical experience in this life. And this suggested to Kant that there is an afterlife in which ultimate justice would be experienced. So this is a transcendental argument, different from an empirical argument. Prabhu utilizes this argument not to say that a type of Christian afterlife exists, which is a heaven and a hell, and after you live once, you die once, and then you go to a heaven or hell type reality, but rather he utilizes an aspect of Kant's argument to argue that the immortality of the soul via reincarnation is true. And what helps him, so he uses that argument, but then he also focuses in our phenomenological experience. And here's what he says on page 66. The seriousness of our endeavor to shape our lives according to the ideals of truth, wisdom, love, and compassion, and all that they entail in terms of the development of virtue, together with the sense of inadequacy in our achievement, warrant the presumption that a single life can not be all that we are destined to have. To grant that would make a mockery of our moral experience. And this again is sort of has these transcendental elements. We're attempting to strive for this, what we might call almost perfect virtue, or at least ideals, right? We're trying to live according to certain ideals. He says truth, love, wisdom, compassion. And this is difficult, for our ideals and our lived experience do not necessarily completely overlap, meaning that we as moral creatures, according to Prabhu, are inadequate. But this concept of reincarnation suggests that over many, many lifetimes, you can continue to perfect your moral character to eventually live up to the ideals, so that your lived action corresponds to truth, wisdom, love, and compassion, those ideals of them. And so eventually your lived experience and your ideals can almost perfectly overlap, or in some cases overlap. But this, according to Dharmic teaching, requires many, many lifetimes. But our striving for them phenomenologically, according to Prabhu, suggest that this could be the case, much like our attempting to be moral and thinking of a concept of ultimate justice suggests that there is such a concept. Much like our understanding ourselves as free suggests that there is such a concept of freedom. So a different focus. Kant, for example, reduced morality to duty, and therefore obeying the categorical imperative, never treating another person as a means to an end, but always an end in themselves, always willing the good out of a goodwill alone. This is seen as duty, and it's unclear, according to Kant, not according to Kant, but it's unclear whether this is understood as taking multiple lifetimes or not. This is something that Kant never really explored. Prabhu sees the project of morality slightly different. And this project of morality in the Dharmic sense, according to Prabhu, suggests more of a paradigm in which many lives help make these endeavors possible. And so Prabhu sees morality in terms of the band of spirituality and spiritual self-knowledge. The movement from ego to reality-centeredness is primarily a movement of self-consciousness and freedom in the sense of moksha, ultimate spiritual liberation. And so the goal is this moving away from ego-centered reality, ego-centeredness to reality-centeredness. And this again this liberation process, according to Dharma tradition, may take many, many lifetimes. And that is sort of the goal of morality, in that sense of not only certain actions out of duty, but certain self-awareness and self-knowledge when doing those actions. So it's not just proper action, but proper knowledge and proper view. This isn't completely different than what Kant thought, because Kant did think that the goodwill needed to be intentional. Not only did it need to know what to will, but it also needed to know how to will it. And that perhaps takes much self-effort. But this is not an aspect that Kant necessarily went into in any of his works. Whereas this is sort of the phenomenological aspect that Prabhu goes into in his paper. So now we might think, okay, we've phenomenologically shared this idea of people striving for morality, and the ideals they strive for don't seem achievable in many lifetimes. And we also sort of provided a transcendental argument for post-existence using the Kantian style argument. But then what else might suggest this pre-life existence or many lives prior? So here it explains that after utilizing a Kantian style argument to suggest post-existence and afterlife, Prabhu cites extreme moral differences among people and their moral aspirations, which might suggest experiences of past lives. This is a quite fascinating argument. I had never really considered this prior to reading this article, but so Prabhu's looking at phenomenological explanations for differences in people's moral striving, sometimes at very early ages. So how do you get such disparity among people and their moral endeavors and their openness to doing significantly what we might call supererogatory moral actions, right? And so he writes, but it is a fact that moral aspirations themselves differ greatly between people. It is also a fact that hindrances to the fulfillment of such aspirations rooted in the character of people differ significantly. In truth, these hindrances determine the nature and extent of moral responses. And to explain this what he might suggest is an empirical difference between people's just willingness to really strive to be the best moral person they can be, and others really just ignoring it or almost just enjoying vice, to use a different way of looking at virtue and vice. He explains, to this question, believers in reincarnation provide a thoroughly causal answer. Those of unequal abilities are such only by virtue of their own actions, the principle of karma, or the moral law of cause and effect. Therefore, since their actions in this life are insufficient to account for their abilities, the latter are due to actions of past lives. So this difference in moral abilities and moral aspirations probably wants to explain by the phenomenon of karma, suggesting again this idea of past lives. So now that Prabhu sort of stated both his transcendental argument and some of the phenomenological characteristics of moral striving and aspirations, he considers three objections. The first objection is that it doesn't really offer reincarnation, doesn't really offer a solution to the inequalities and natural evils that pervade existence. We'll look at that in a moment. Two is that the belief in reincarnation is likely to produce a fatalism, or at least a passivity, meaning if you're in this life and you don't experience much moral aspirations, you might just say, oh, it's my fate not to because of prior karmas. He doesn't want to say that, so we'll look at some of the reasons why. And three, that the claim of evolution in a moral education is undercut if, in fact, we lack memories of our previous lives, which most of us do. And here, evolution, again, is not necessarily being used in any scientific way, but rather it's just saying that reincarnation suggests that you can make improvements in your moral being or moral character over many lives. And this, in that sense, is called progress, in that you're making moral progress over many lifetimes. But here, the Objection is that if you can't remember what happened in your past lives, how will you ever make moral progress? And so Prabhu responds to each one of these, and we'll go and look through these. So John Hick articulates the point one, right? And so here's what Hick says. Prabhu's quoting John Hick. Hick is also the one that suggested the soul-making theodicy for the problem of evil. But so this is Hick speaking. For we are no nearer to an ultimate explanation of the circumstances of our present birth when we are told that they are consequences of previous life, if that previous life has turned out to be explained in reference to yet a previous life, and that by reference to another, and so on in an infinite regress. One can affirm the beginningless character of the soul's existence in this way, but one cannot then claim that it renders either intelligible or morally acceptable the inequalities of our present lot. The solution has not been produced, but only postponed infinitely. And so again, they say, well, why am I in this situation? Why do I have this particular moral character? They say, well, because from a past life, then another past life, then another past life ad infinitum. And Hick says it doesn't explain it. So Prabhu responds to this objection by saying, first, in the Dharmic context, the point of the eternity of past lives is to observe one's choices and the decision-making over many lifetimes and to learn from one's mistake. And so Prabhu writes, no doubt some were disposed to make better choices at that stage, but the inequity of the conditions that produce the different choices, some better, some worse, matters less in an infinite time frame than the conviction that one alone is responsible for one's present state. After all, everyone has a chance to learn from their mistakes and the difficult situations they find themselves in. The fact that it may take longer for some than others matters little in an infinite time span. So again, Prabhu suggested if one takes this idea of reincarnation seriously and infinite lifespan seriously, the conditions of your previous life are very, what we might say, trivial in scope to this infinite possibility to progress. So it may take 5, it may take 50 lifetimes, but what is that for an infinite time scale? And the point, the dharmic point in this is understanding past mistakes and learning from them. This again will go into objection 3, but this is how Prabhu responds to it. Objection 2, reincarnation produces some type of fatalism. The objection goes something like, if what we are is conditioned by our past actions, then we are fated to bear their consequences, good or bad, and there is nothing we can do to change our lot. And here Prabhu says this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of what karma means. And so he explains it. Every act of ours has a double result, which we may term its direct and indirect result. The direct result is the pain or pleasure which follows upon the act depending upon its nature. The indirect result is the tendency that is created to repeat the act again if it was pleasant and to avoid it in the future if it was painful, which is a negative way of expressing the first proposition to the extent that the act of avoiding something painful can itself be conceived as a pleasurable act. The, quote, necessity inherent in the law of karma applies only to the direct result. There is no way of avoiding the immediate consequences of what we do. Where the indirect result is concerned, we may grant that we are predisposed to perform the act again, but we have a measure of freedom in succumbing to that predisposition or resisting it. So we might think, Prabhu uses the example of a person who's been smoking for a while. They're predisposed to want to smoke more cigarettes, but that doesn't mean that they can't quit. Particularly, they can start changing their actions and changing their behavior and the way they think about it, such that over time, this predisposition to want to smoke more fades over time until the predisposition or the tendency is gone, and it's not a necessity of wanting to smoke anymore, nor should it have been understood that way, but rather there was a strong desire to, it was preconditioned from past events of smoking. But then if we start to react differently, that reaction fades over time and can become non-existent. And this is essentially this counterpoint. This is where the freedom is. to change our practice. So over time, these, what we might call direct results fade, or the indirect results of our behavior fade, and new behavior can be initiated. Thus, far from being fatalistic, this is probably still commenting on this. In its implication, the karma theory is optimistic. Our past actions may have produced our present state, but in the measure of freedom that we enjoy, we can direct our present actions towards the betterment of a moral nature in the future. And this, again, in many lifetimes, this is seen as an excellent thing because one can completely reshape their moral nature over many lifetimes. And objection number 3, moral development requires remembering our past actions. This point is expressed in the following way. This point leads to the third objection, the question whether we can benefit from the just retribution involved in karma if we have no memory of our previous lives. The response to this is rather fascinating. And here I'll go ahead and read it, and then we can reflect on it a bit. Here Prabhu states, but it depends on what we mean here by memory, in quotes. If we mean by that the preservation of a comprehensive span of memories describing our situation, then surely that condition is too strong for establishing identity. None of us find his sense of identity weakened by the fact that he has no memories of the first years of childhood. That our conscious identity in that case is established by spatial temporal continuity is true. And of course, that distinguishes a previous life that we cannot remember from circumstances of our present life that we have forgotten. But we may point to a weaker but still intelligible sense of memory, where continuity of memory is established through persistence of disposition and tendency. The fact that the circumstances of our present life may not satisfactorily explain our skills, traits, or weaknesses forces us back, if we accept the principle of karma, to a consideration of previous lives. That we may have no conscious memory of them is not fatal, because all that the karma theory asserts is that the past lives will have an effect on the present. If this is so, we may grant that we are in fact different persons in different lives, while holding on to the dispositional continuity carried by the soul. So here he defines memory as dispositional continuity. This also goes back to that first idea. I'll go back to that first slide, he said. Next, I shall argue that there is a good reason for survival should take an embodied rather than a disembodied form. That embodied form allows for this dispositional continuity to exist. And so in that type of memory, we have a continuity. And this is what karma suggests. Not necessarily that we have to remember every detail from every past life, much like we don't have to remember every detail from our current life, and especially from year 1 and year 2. Many people have no memory of that, but we have this dispositional continuity. And that's what he is explaining that karma means. Lastly, just to look at this idea of empirical investigations, Prabhu does cite some interesting evidence of people having past life memories or past life abilities. This, he says, is interesting. Again, is it scientific? Well, that's somewhat debatable, particularly one thing that makes it debatable is that it doesn't cohere to our current scientific paradigm of scientific or medical materialism, which suggests that all that exists is matter, its movements and modifications. Here, karma, it's not clear how a concept like that would cohere with any of the sciences, nor is it clear how a concept like reincarnation would. So Prabhu does cite interesting empirical anomalies that are difficult for scientific materialism to explain, but that doesn't necessarily make it scientific. This is not a problem, Prabhu thinks, though, because his argument is not necessarily empirical in nature. His argument is not relying on these empirical studies about people with past lives. It's transcendental in nature. So it looks at the phenomenological experience. It looks at what makes that phenomenological experience possible. And ultimately, what makes that phenomenological experience possible is this belief that the purpose of our morality is this spiritual self-knowledge that goes from ego-centered to reality-centered and really requires living multiple lives, perhaps seemingly infinite multiple lives. Right? This is what Prabhu suggests is our moral experience. And to have that not be true, Prabhu says, and I'll read this passage again, this is quite a fascinating passage. He says, the seriousness of our endeavor to shape our lives according to the ideals of truth, wisdom, love, and compassion, and all they entail in terms of the development of virtue, together with the sense of inadequacy in our actual achievement, warrant the presumption that a single life cannot be all we have, or all that we are destined to have. To grant that would make a mockery of our moral experience. And here he finds that this phenomenological evidence put in the the transcendental way of arguing is sufficient to say, not that he's proved the existence of an afterlife, but sufficient to make it plausible. And this is essentially Prabhu's argument it was a particular type of argument for a particular type of afterlife based off a particular type of moral experience. So I hope everyone has enjoyed this presentation, and likewise, I hope that everyone has enjoyed this course. I've enjoyed giving the lecture, and I look forward to the discussions about this particular topic. Take care.